إنه الصوت مش متعلق من عندها، بتطلع منيح على الفيس إذا الصوت اللي بحكي منيح.
اوكي صح.
اوكي
ممتاز، معك حق افنان، تمام سوري صح مزبوط. يلا توكل.
نعم بنا.
مساء الخير للجميع. Good afternoon everyone. بسعدنا في مدى الكرمل وجودكم كلكم معنا، وانا متاكده انه كمان شوي رح يكون العدد كثير اكبر. Thank you all for participating in this very special event. مدى الكرمل is thrilled to have Professor Mahmood Mamdani with us tonight and to listen to his very insightful thoughts on his new book, Neither Settler Nor Native, which is also very relevant to our situation in Palestine, Israel. Professor Mamdani is the Herbert Lehman Professor of Government and the Professor of Anthropology and of Middle Eastern, South Asian, very relevant. I'm hearing double myself twice.
Sorry, it was a mistake. We solved it. Continue, please.
Okay. So we are honored and thrilled to introduce Professor Mahmood Mamdani and have him with us today and listen to his insights from his new book, Neither Settler Nor Native, The Making and Unmaking of Permanent Minorities, from Harvard University Press, which was issued just recently in December 2020. Professor Mahmood Mamdani is the Herbert Lehman Professor of Government and the Professor of Anthropology and of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies, MESAAS, at Columbia University. He is also the director of the McCarrier Institute of Social Research in Kampala, Uganda. Professor Mamdani was born in India, grew up in Uganda, and gained his academic education in the US, during which he also participated and even jailed during the civil movement's march in 1960s. Professor Mamdani holds a PhD degree in governments from Harvard University from 1974, titled Politics and Class Formation in Uganda. In addition to his book that we'll discuss today, Neither Settler Nor Native, The Making and Unmaking of Permanent Minorities, from Harvard University Press, Professor Mamdani is also the author of several books, including Defense and Rule, Native as Political Identity, from Harvard University Press 2012, When Victims Become Killers, Colonialism, Nativism, and the Genocide in Rwanda, Princeton University Press 2001, Citizens and Subjects, Contemporary Africa and the Legacy of Late Colonialism, from Princeton University Press 1996, and of several scholarly articles that really have his fingerprint in his field. He specializes in the study of African and international politics, colonialism and post-colonialism, the politics of knowledge and production. His work explores the intersection between politics and culture, a comparative study of colonialism since 1452, and the history of civil war and genocide in Africa, in addition to the Cold War and War on Terror and the history and theory of human rights. Professor Mamdani, we are honored and thrilled to listen to your book and to your lecture in all other areas that you would like to share with us. You have 30 minutes.
Thank you very much. My book is about the nation state and about post-colonial modernity. The introduction opens with a discussion of the two phases of the nation state, the non-liberal and the liberal phase. I argue that the nation state was born in Iberia in 1492. Its agenda was summed up by a single slogan: one country, one people, one religion. This state project set fire to relations between majority and minorities within its boundaries, setting in motion processes of ethnic cleansing, specifically of Jews and Muslims. There followed a century of religious wars in Europe. This was the first, the non-liberal phase in the making of the nation state. The liberal solution to religious wars was reflected in the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Two key components of the modern state were born at Westphalia: religious toleration at home and the reciprocal guarantee of sovereignty abroad. The liberal solution was put forward in John Locke's treatise on tolerance. Catholics can be tolerated if they renounce any political support of the Pope or of any power outside England. This is how Locke formulated the key tenet of the liberal theory of the nation state. The liberal notion of the nation state turned majority and minority into permanent political identities. Only the majority has sovereignty. The minority cannot participate in sovereignty. The notion of a sovereign majority alongside non-sovereign minorities was the original sin in the liberal theory of the nation state. Now, in this book, I explore the export of the notion of different kinds of citizens, sovereign and non-sovereign, from the US to South Africa and Nazi Germany, and finally to Israel. At the same time, the book explores the construction of an epistemological project that grounded the political distinction between sovereign and non-sovereign subjects in an epistemic and legal distinction. The distinction between religious groups was further developed into a civilizational difference between races and tribes. This development is explored in some detail in the chapter on Sudan. This is a book about the United States as a founding experience in modern colonialism. The first chapter explores the Indian reservation as the site where core institutions of modern colonialism were forged. It is also a book about extreme violence as a consequence of modern nation-state building in the post-colonies. Should we think of extreme violence as the consequence of a criminal project executed by individuals, no matter how many, following the criminal model popularized by Nuremberg and today upheld by the ICC? Or should we think of it as a political project, a notion born of the transition from apartheid in South Africa? What can we learn from the failure of denazification and the relative success of post-apartheid South Africa? Finally, the book asks, what is transportable in the South African experience? What does South Africa have to teach us? To answer this question, the last chapter takes a fresh look, a look through South African lenses at Israel-Palestine, the most intractable political problem in today's world. In this talk, I'd like to comment on 4 issues. First, by taking the US as a case, I seek to compare the conquest of Indians and the domination of Africans, to distinguish between colonial conquest and racial domination as 2 different modern ways of subjugation, each with a radically different consequence. Second, I ask, what is the difference between an immigrant and a settler? Third, I suggest we think of 2 different ways of thinking of political identity, one as historically unchangeable and the other as natural and permanent. To historicize identity is to see it as born of a particular form of the state, and therefore as changeable. But to see identity as natural and thus a permanent claim is to see identity as a timeless expression of a trans-historical and innate cultural self. Finally, I suggest that we decouple the nation and the state as we seek an alternative to the nation state. Let me begin with a discussion of American Indians and African Americans in the US. What's in a name? How should we call the pre-Columbian resident communities of the Americas? As Indian or as native? Indian is the name Columbus gave peoples of the New World. Though native is today considered a more politically correct designation, neither the US government nor the peoples they've colonized have embraced this term. The museum dedicated to pre-Columbian era in Washington, D.C. is called the National Museum of the American Indian. It's not called the National Museum of the Native American. What difference would it make if we were to call this museum the National Museum of the Native American and not the American Indian? Why is it that the 1964 Civil Rights Act did not apply to Indians in reservations, so that a separate Indian Civil Rights Act had to be passed in 1968? To be sure, the two acts are not the same. The 1964 Act is constitutionally binding, whereas the 1968 Indian Act is not. It is only advisory. Reservation Indians are not and have never been rights-bearing citizens of the US in a constitutional sense. There were no reservations before the United States. The reservation was a creation of the US. The reservation is geographically within the territory of the US, but it is a polity separate from the United States. The Europeans who came to America were not immigrants, they were settlers. What is the difference? Immigrants come to join existing polities, whether they seek equality or advantage in it. Settlers come to displace existing polities and establish their own exclusive sovereignty. Indian reservations are not part of the sovereign state we call the United States. In the words of Chief Justice John Marshall, writing in mid-19th century, reservations are, quote, domestic dependent colonies. The term Indian tribal sovereignty, another politically correct phrase, in fact masks colonial domination. Legally, reservation Indians are wards of Congress. Reservation authorities are overseen by a vast federal bureaucracy known as the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The BIA is no different from the colonial bureaucracy that governed any indirect rule colony in Africa. The Indian reservation was part of a two-state solution. The two-state solution, a sovereign state alongside a non-sovereign protectorate, was Lincoln's contribution in the second half of the 19th century. Lincoln claimed to provide a permanent solution for Indians who had survived the genocide. Germany after Nuremberg also embraced a two-state solution. Instead of reintegrating Jews as equal citizens in a single state, as part of a one-state solution, post-Nazi Germany embraced the idea of a separate state for Jews after the Holocaust. The fact is that the Nazi project may have been defeated militarily, but it survived politically. The two-state solution gave a longer lease to the Nazi political agenda. The latest version of the two-state solution is in Israel-Palestine. In contrast to South Africa, where the native population was subordinated, majority of the population in Israel was expelled outside its boundaries, as it had been in the US when Indians were herded into reservations. America also originated the notion of differentiated citizenship, with only some participating in sovereignty. Until 1921, Indians were nationals, but not citizens. After that, Indians had to be naturalized as citizens. They had first to be purged as members of Indian polities before they could become US citizens. Colonized Indians and African slaves represent two different experiences in the modern era. Whereas their land was forcibly taken from Indians, African slaves were forcibly taken from the land. Indians were colonized, Africans enslaved, and dominated racially. The consequences have been radically different. Reservation Indians have a different relationship to the US from that of African Americans. Racial and colonial domination are not the same, even if racial discrimination is common to both. Colonization refers to conquest of territory. The American Indian symbolized land which has been taken. The African slave embodied captive and coerced labor. Politically, Indians were governed in a protectorate as part of a two-state solution. African slaves were racially segregated within a one-state polity and governed in thousands of separate plantation regimes. The one-state solution provided a political frame for the development of the struggle against Jim Crow and racial domination, even if it proceeded by fits and starts, sometimes even receding. The one-state framework made possible the development of alliances. The two-state solution explains the continued isolation and colonial subjugation of the reservation Indian. We can see the big difference between the two in the US. The one-state solution has provided a political context for alliance building leading to a general emancipatory struggle. In contrast, a two-state solution has imposed isolation on an oppressed group by imposing on it a separate political home, a protectorate. Politically, a one-state solution is preferable to a two-state solution. The American model was exported to a number of places, among these South Africa, Germany, and Israel. South African settlers attained state independence in 1910. Settlers studied the North American experience on how Indians were governed. Three key elements of governance were imported to South Africa: homeland, traditional authority, and customary law. The starting fiction was that every tribe has a territorially contained homeland from time immemorial. The fiction of a homeland was actually a program to expel each tribe from the bulk of its historical lands. Second, it was claimed that every homeland has from time immemorial been administered by a traditional authority, sanctioned by custom, and thus not subject to popular accountability. Finally, the obligation of this traditional authority, it was said, is to enforce a customary law on the homeland. The legitimacy of custom was said to be that it too has been there from time immemorial. This time, though, settlers insisted that custom be excised of all practices or notions that settlers considered repugnant to civilization. I will discuss the lessons of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa after a discussion of Germany and Israel. South Africa was not the only one that learned from the US. So did Nazi Germany and Hitler. Hitler drew two lessons. One, that genocide is doable and therefore thinkable. Two, that there can be a second and a third class citizenship, as of Puerto Ricans, African Americans, and Indian citizens after 1921. Hitler appointed a committee of lawyers to study American citizenship laws. This background preparation led to the drafting of Nuremberg laws. This learning process has been documented in some detail by the historian James Q. Whitman of Yale in his book, Hitler's American Model. Post-war denazification failed because the Allies shut their eyes to the political project that inspired and propelled Nazism. Nazism was a striving for a purified nation state, one that would go beyond distinguishing the national majority from national minorities to purifying the nation by expunging it of all minorities. I argue that Nuremberg failed to root out Nazism politically. Unlike the criminal model, which understands violence as the result of antisocial acts of individual perpetrators, I focus on extreme violence as an outcome of collective mobilization against minorities in the nation state. Rather than individualize the violence as a standalone act, I point to cycles of violence sustained by groups mobilized as so many constituencies. Rather than catalog atrocities so as to name, shame, and punish its perpetrators, I seek to identify the issues around which constituencies are mobilized. Rather than exclude perpetrators from the political process, I seek to include them along with all those who survived: victims, perpetrators, beneficiaries, bystanders. I use the term survivor differently from how it was used after the Holocaust or after the Rwandan genocide, not just to refer to surviving victims of extreme violence, but to all those who survived extreme violence. Let me come to Israel and the US. Are Jewish people in Israel settlers or immigrants? The Jewish population of Mandate Palestine belonged to three groups. First, there were those who had never left. These were natives. Then there were those who returned on a pilgrimage seeking a religious homeland. They were content to be part of the existing polity. This was the first aliyah of immigrants. And finally, there were those who wanted their own exclusive polity, a Jewish nation state in place of the existing polity. They came in the second and third aliyah. These were the settlers. The Zionist striving for a nation state cannot be understood unless we also grasp the lesson they drew from Germany. Victims of the nation state project in Germany and in Europe, Zionists decided to set up a nation state in Eretz Israel. The Zionist state project has unfolded in two phases. The first reduced the Palestinians from a majority to a minority. This was the Nakba. The Zionist project has continued to demonize the minority that remained within its territorial boundaries as a demographic threat, demanding that their numbers be further cut down. In reality, the Nakba never ended. It continues. Palestinians inside Israel do not participate in sovereignty. They have rights, even political rights, including the right to vote, but they do not participate in power. This vision has become clearer as the state project has been redefined, from Israel as a Jewish and democratic state to Israel as a Jewish state. I have already spelled out the significance of the debate on one state versus two-state solution. One state would be akin to direct racial domination, whereas a two-state solution would create a protectorate and lead to indirect colonialism under Zionist rule. The history of the African slave in America shows that a one-state solution is a better framework for building alliances and broadening the frame and depth of resistance. But to have a future, that resistance needs to look for a third alternative. I propose that we look at the South African transition from apartheid to glimpse the vision of a third alternative. Excuse me. I argue that the anti-apartheid resistance took a creative turn in the 1970s, leading to an epistemological and political breakthrough for the anti-apartheid movement. Before the 70s, anti-apartheid politics was largely derivative. It reproduced the architecture of apartheid, each racial group organized separately, as defined by apartheid power. Africans as ANC, Indians as Natal Indian Congress, coloreds as Colored People's Congress, and whites as Congress of Democrats. By reproducing the architecture of apartheid inside the resistance, resistance gave apartheid a natural flavor. The apartheid mindset was broken only in the 1970s. The key initiative came from the student movement, starting when Black students, led by Biko, left the liberal white student organization, formed their own separate body, and went on to organize township dwellers, starting with Soweto. Left in the wilderness, radical white students turned to organizing hostile workers on the fringes of townships. Out of this experience was born an epistemological awakening that white and black are political identities, and that political identity is historical, not natural. Black, said Biko, is not a color. If you're oppressed, you're black. There was nothing inevitable about the impact of BC on the anti-apartheid struggle. BC, or black consciousness, could have led to a nation-state consciousness, claiming that South Africa is a black nation of the black majority, thus essentializing black as a trans-historical identity. Instead, it led to an epistemological awakening, the consciousness of black as a historical political identity. Afrikaners too made a journey from being junior partners of British colonialism to being part of the anti-apartheid coalition. But there was no consensus. The South African moment was born in the 70s and 80s. There was a threefold shift in vision. From opposition to apartheid, the movement looked for an alternative to apartheid. Rather than just turning the world upside down, it dared to think of a different world. From a state of the majority, the national majority, the black majority, it looked to create a state of all the people. From opposition to whites, it went on to oppose white power. The turning point was when anti-apartheid forces reformulated their demand for black majority rule, now as non-racial rule. Rather than deny the existence of race as phenotypical difference, they refused to endow racial difference with a political significance. The first step to decolonizing the political was deracialization. The next step would be detribalization. Rather than deny the cultural significance of tribe as an ethnic group, detribalization would decouple the link between culture and territory, ethnicity and homeland, citizenship and identity, forged under colonialism. To do so would be to reverse the politicization of culture under apartheid through the creation of homelands, homeland authority, and customary law. The result would be to create a single citizenship, not multiple citizenships based on separate identifications, race in the central state and tribe in the homelands. 1994 created formal political equality in South Africa regardless of race. It has yet to create formal political equality in the former homelands regardless of ethnic identity. My claim is that a successful struggle for social justice will need to cut across the political divide imposed by race and tribe. Without political equality, the mobilization of social justice will be fragmented into so many races and tribes. 1994 was the birth of a new political community. Instead of a rupture into two separate communities, one of victims of apartheid and another of perpetrators, blacks and whites, which would have required a partition of South Africa. Let us not forget that in 1994, Afrikaners divided, with a minority asking for a homeland, where Afrikaners would have their own state. The political community that did emerge in 1994 was that of survivors of apartheid, not just victims who survived, but all survivors, whether victims, perpetrators, beneficiaries, or bystanders. Apartheid power was not defeated. Neither did apartheid win. The situation in the mid-1980s could only be described as a stalemate. Why then did apartheid agree to negotiate in 1990? Two considerations made captains of apartheid rethink their primary reliance on a military strategy. One, the possibility that anti-apartheid mobilization may spread from the townships to Bantustans. But more important was the second possibility, one that signaled the likelihood of an even more scary outcome. Boers realized that the hitherto pro-apartheid Boer intelligentsia was gradually beginning to abandon apartheid as a state project, looking for an alternative project. The principal critique of 1994 is that there was no social justice. This critique both states a truism and misses the political rebirth that did happen in 1994. I argue that we should see the rebirth as the beginning of political decolonization, without which the decolonization of society would be far more difficult. Let me come to Israel-Palestine. I would like to begin with a note on political Zionism. At the core of political Zionism is the effort to build not just a Jewish religious community in the Holy Land, but a Jewish state. Political Zionism seeks to erase the distinction between state and society. The conflation of society with state is the foundation of the nation state and its program of rule by a permanent national majority. The nation state may call itself a democracy, as Israel does, but this majority is not actually determined through political contestation. Rather, the majority is defined pre-politically, as it is the nation itself. The most the majority can hope for is a democracy for the majority, but not for all. But even majoritarian democracy remains a difficult project in Israel because the state defines who can be a member of that majority. In other words, who is officially recognized as a Jew. The most fundamental of Israel's unanswered questions is who is a Jew. If Israel is to be a state for Jews only, it must answer the question, who is a Jew? Its answer cannot avoid flattening the diversity of world Jewry into the Jewry sanctioned by the state. At the legal level, this question has bedeviled Israeli authorities since the law of return was passed in 1950. Is a Jew defined by religion or by ethnicity? Are Jews members of a religious community or a nationality, or both? As a result, the state of Israel now has two legal definitions of who is a Jew. The narrow definition provided by halakha, religious law, which Israel enforces in the sphere of personal affairs, and the broad definition in the amended law of return. At the political and social level, Judaization eliminates unacceptable forms of Jewishness. The acceptable form is associated with Ashkenazim, who trace their lineage to Yiddish-speaking parts of Europe. Ashkenazim were the founders of the state, who embraced the role of civilizers committed to bring other Jews into line with the national ideal. In particular, Ashkenazim have sought to civilize Mizrahim. The Mizrahim are the Arab Jews. They present a special challenge to Zionism, for Zionism presumes that Arab and Jewish identity are both incompatible and indelibly hostile towards one another. Otherwise, there would be no need of a Jewish state in historic Palestine. Ashkenazi Israel has demanded of the Mizrahim that they renounce their Arab culture and embrace only their religion, Judaism. No wonder the Mizrahim have paid back by standing behind a religious Zionism that stands to the right of the Ashkenazim, politically sidelining it. For the Mizrahim, there are two political enemies, not only Palestinians, but also Ashkenazi Israel. In the Zionist worldview, Palestinians are Canaanites who never left home. They are squatters, not natives. With the return of the native after the Holocaust, the squatter must get out of the way and make room for the natives civilized by 500 years in the West. The Palestinian resistance has led to multiple shifts in the Palestinian liberation movement. From an early focus on armed struggle and following the First and Second Intifada, Palestinian mobilization in Israel and the occupied territories has moved to a demand for political change. The goal has been to undo the Jewish state and replace it with a state of all citizens. Israel's political response has been to fragment Palestinians into three disconnected groups: Palestinian citizens of Israel, Palestinians in the occupied territories, and Palestinian refugees. The development of a Palestinian consciousness straddling these three groups has been an outcome of a protracted process whose focus and center of gravity have shifted radically over time, from exile to home, and from an all or nothing demand for Israel's disintegration to a demand for involvement in the Israeli political process. Organizationally, this has involved a threefold transition. At first, displaced Palestinians looked to an Arab frontline states to be their protectors and liberators. After these Arab states were defeated in 1967, Palestinians turned to the nascent and exile-led PLO, an armed resistance movement. In 1982, Israel went to war in Lebanon. The brainchild of Ariel Sharon, then the defense minister, the Lebanon War was in fact a total war against the Palestinians. The IDF deployed well over 120,000 troops for over 10 weeks. It was the country's largest mobilization since the 1973 war, according to the Palestinian historian Rashid Khalidi. Outgunned and overwhelmed, the PLO withdrew to Tunis. But while the PLO was defeated, Sharon's strategic objective remained unrealized. Instead, the war intended to suppress Palestinian resistance only stoked it further. With the exiled armed resistance smashed, the moment was ripe for political mobilization at home. The first Intifada in the late 1980s crystallized the internalization of Palestinian leadership, and with it, a definitive rejection of the failed armed resistance championed by the external leadership with a mainly refugee base. Arafat made two crucial compromises at Oslo. First, he tacitly accepted settlements in the West Bank. Second, he explicitly accepted Israel's stranglehold over the economy and sovereignty of the occupied territories, even going so far as to agree that this stranglehold would persist in a future Palestinian state. A second Intifada, beginning in 2000, brought together Palestinians in Israel and the occupied territories under a single movement. Both Intifadas responded to the failings of the official PLO. The second, in particular, reflected frustration over the PLO's capitulation to Zionism at the Oslo Accords of 1993 and the onward rush of settlements that followed it. The success of the second Intifada led to mobilization under Balad, a political party then led by Azmi Bishara, a Palestinian member of the Knesset. On May 21, 2001, Bishara proposed a new basic law aimed at achieving rights for Palestinians as a national minority. In the months that followed, Bishara presented another bill countering the false claim that Israel is a democratic state. It did so by asking the Knesset to rewrite that assertion in its basic law and instead affirm that Israel is a state of all its citizens. Whereas Bishara's first bill sought equal rights for the national minority, now he was asking the Knesset to reject the idea that Israel is a nation state, a state of the Jewish people, explicitly thereby negating the existence of both the national minority and the national majority. Over the past decade, Palestinian politics has moved from an engagement predominantly internal to one predominantly external. The external engagement called for a state of all its citizens. The internal engagement called for a state of all its citizens as a counter to the Zionist project for a Jewish state. The external engagement takes the form of an international boycott of the Israeli state and society under BDS. To the extent that BDS calls for the de-Zionization of the state of Israel, there is reason to give it enthusiastic support. But to the extent that BDS seeks to extend this boycott to Israeli society and not just to its Zionist sectors, there is reason to be critical. BDS needs to learn from the very experience it claims to build on. That is the South African divestment and boycott during apartheid. The main problem with blanket boycotts is that they embrace a mirror image of the nation-state framework, which collapses state and society into one. By themselves, international boycotts are incomplete. The strategy of isolating the state internationally needs to be aligned with a domestic strategy to win over forces that are either indifferent or opposed to the Zionist state in the ongoing struggle to isolate its supporters. What can BDS learn from the South African experience? First, the anti-apartheid struggle was not directed from a single center, but from multiple centers. Not only did the struggle include multiple initiatives, they were sometimes contradictory. Take the example of the anti-apartheid boycott, which was directed from outside the country, and the internal political struggle, which demanded reform of the political process to allow the oppressed majority the right to participate in the political process, whereby the anti-apartheid boycott made no distinction between South African state and society, calling for a boycott of both. The internal political struggle proceeded by building alliances with all sectors of white society, so long as they did not openly and actively support the apartheid state. Second, whereas BDS can contribute to Israel's international isolation, something more is needed if a non-Zionist alternative is to bloom in Israel itself. Like in South Africa, that something else is an epistemic revolution that will open the way to a political one. Phase 2 of the Palestinian moment will come when the same dynamic that leads to the unity of the oppressed will also lead to the isolation of the oppressors. When it is not just the oppressed who seek political change, but also many of the current supporters of Zionist power. Getting there will require a new kind of political consciousness within Israel, a consciousness based on the recognition that the flourishing of Jews and Jewish life does not require a Zionist state. It is this South African lesson that needs to be driven home to Israelis, as many as possible, that Jews do not need to have a Jewish state to have a secure home in Israel-Palestine. The lesson for BDS is that they need to build on the gains made by Balad. To do so would be to provide a political home to all anti-Zionist and even non-Zionist groups. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Mamdani. It was really important, and for me, it was especially eye-opening to talk about survivors in a different way than we all are used to join the oppressors with the victims and actually treat all those who survive following an extreme violence to a one unity is interesting. And also the differentiation between immigrants and settlers and like kind of translating it into the Palestinian-Israeli situation and treating different moves of Jewish immigration as immigration versus a colonial settler. But before we turn to questions, and I already see one, I would like to introduce Dr. Mark Ayyash. Dr. Ayyash will join us and comment on Professor Mamdani's book and lecture. Dr. Ayyash is...
Mark, do I mute? Mark?
Sorry?
Yeah, okay.
Dr. Mark Muhannad Ayyash is Associate Professor of Sociology at Mount Royal University, Canada. He's the author of Hermeneutics of Violence from 2019. Dr. Ayyash teaches and writes in the areas of social and political theory, post-colonial theory, the study of violence and decolonial movements, particularly focusing on the Palestinian-Israeli struggle. He has published several academic articles in journals such as Interventions and the European Journal of Social Theory, and has a co-edited book on protests and generations in the Middle East and North Africa and the Mediterranean. Dr. Ayyash, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Banna. Everybody can hear me, I think. I really appreciate it. It's an honor to be on this panel to speak about Mahmood Mamdani's excellent book and to be invited here by al-Carmel. It's a pleasure. Masa al-khair ya jama'a. Originally born and raised in Silwan before immigrating to Canada. Always
his name is Muhannad.
Mark Muhannad Ayyash, that's right. So it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be with you all today here. Okay, so let me start my commentary with a quick quote from the great Edward Said. And I quote, it's from his essay representing the colonized Anthropology's interlocutors. And I quote, "What Fanon and Césaire required of their own partisans, even during the heat of struggle, was to abandon fixed ideas of settled identity and culturally authorized definition. Become different," they said, "in order that your fate as colonized peoples can be different. This is why nationalism, for all its obvious necessity, is also the enemy." End quote. Mahmood Mamdani's masterful analysis of colonial modernity in this book engenders a number of important and difficult questions that the reader cannot shy away from. Among them are, and let me try to pose these in the simplest way possible, what is the path of decolonization? How can we set ourselves on that path? What is the nation state and what is it meant to accomplish? Does its original or foundational purpose serve those who are struggling for a decolonized world today? How do we frame and make sense of extreme violence like murderous ethnic cleansing and genocide, and how do we end it? How do we transform political orders from ones that enact extreme violence to ones that end such violence? Does this transformation need to be simultaneously political, juridical, social, cultural, and economic? Or do we prioritize the political in our decolonial efforts? And how are we to understand this transformation vis-a-vis the victims and the perpetrators? If we shift our understanding of both as survivors, are the victims and perpetrators able to take the same path towards survivorhood? Will they be walking there from the same positionality? So is the transformation required of each of the same order and scope? Let me try to approach some of these questions by first briefly exploring what I think is a constructive theoretical, and I'll start with theory, with a theoretical tension between Mamdani's book and a book also published in 2020 by his colleague at Columbia University, Hamid Dabashi. The title of Hamid's book is "The Emperor is Naked: On the Inevitable Demise of the Nation State." Very briefly, Dabashi argues in that book that the post-colonial state does not hold an organic connection with the people, with the nations over whom it rules. In opposing the violences of the state, Dabashi suggests, and I quote, "a complete decoupling of the nation and the state," end quote. He argues, though, in his book that the nation needs to be rescued from the state. As the Palestinian nation teaches for Dabashi, he argues the nation is the collectivity of the people who have a shared and layered, as opposed to a univocal and bounded, historical archive, set of lived experiences, interests, identities, struggles, and sense of belonging in the world. Against this nation, the state, in a quote from Dabashi, is predicated on pure violence and with no claim to public sovereignty and or political legitimacy, end quote. Dabashi makes the case that national liberation and national consciousness, but not the state building project of nationalism, which he is critical of, but he argues that national liberation and national consciousness are crucial to the struggle, just as Fanon argued long ago. So in Dabashi, the nation is neither held nor secured by the state, but is rather suppressed, oppressed, and eliminated by the state. So in this struggle, nations are striving to achieve, and I quote, "their own stateless sovereignty," end quote. That is a national sovereignty that both precedes and exceeds the states. The nation then is the domain that is sovereign from the state, precisely because the state can never fully control it, eradicate it, or saturate its possibility, or fully thwart its revolutionary potential. Now, like Dabashi, Mamdani also argues, of course, for the decoupling of the nation state, but in Mamdani, it is the state that needs to be rescued, as it were, from the nation. The problem is not the state structure itself in Mamdani's work as a structure that redistributes and distributes resources, provides security and protection, builds social welfare systems, produces and enacts laws, and so on. So the problem is not with that structure, but with the hijacking of the state structure by a majoritarian national identity that then oppresses, exploits, and brutalizes minority nationalities. So to oppose and transform the nation state, Mamdani calls for decolonizing the political, where, and there's 3 steps to this that are really critical to always keep with each other. 1, citizenship is granted, and I quote, on the basis of residence rather than identity, end quote. 2, we denationalize states where overarching non-national federal state structures can enable local autonomy and sovereignty, and that will help flourish diversity. And 3, we re-educate the public imagination towards a critical reflexivity that accentuates how our identities can always be politically remade, quote, bolstering democracy in place of neoliberal human rights remedies, end quote. And it's always critical, I think, to highlight that the 3 are together in Mamdani's version of decolonizing the political, because that's what separates it from the classic liberalism model, right? If you only focus on number 1 on equal citizenships, you're not going to challenge the sort of the supremacy of the master ethnos, which is a key feature of the liberal nation state, which Mamdani is opposed to. So you have to take all of these 3 together to properly understand his argument around decolonizing the political. So when we juxtapose Dabashi and Mamdani, I think we arrive at the agreed assertion that the coupling of the nation and the state produced a monster. But instead of taking a firm position, as each of them does in their own disciplinary and theoretical traditions, on which part of the now decoupled elements, either the state or the nation, can guide us towards a decolonized future, I wonder today if we can benefit instead from a kind of agonism between the spheres of the social and the political, beyond their particular configuration in that monstrous coupling of the Euro-American nation state. So the social political for me are questions that are much bigger than this latest version of their relationship in the Euro-American nation state. So I want to take that constant tension between the social and the political on that larger theoretical level, where there's an agonism that doesn't produce a winner between them. And there's always, there's neither side overpowers the other. So my first theoretical question to Mahmoud more specifically is this: is not a decolonization of the social as foundational and necessary as a decolonization of the political? If we understand the social as the space where the social collectivity forms and takes shape, that social bond of the collective we, that asabiyya that Ibn Khaldun illuminated for us many centuries ago, if we understand the social as this space where colonized people marked for erasure and elimination set themselves on the path of opposing their fragmentation, of asserting and reasserting their humanity, of articulating and re-articulating their collectivity, of reinvigorating their ability to mobilize and wield the power of the we, cannot and should not that social space serve as equally foundational to the project of decolonization? Is that not necessary for a properly decolonial political space? In other words, is not the social more than social justice? Social justice is a concept that is useful in describing specific projects for equity, equality, redistribution of resources, and so on. But social justice as a cluster of specific and contextual projects is not to be conflated, I don't think, with the social as such. So what to do with the social remains a big question for me, decolonizing the social. And the question of whether that is the space where decolonization may indeed gain its vitality, formative structure, and direction. Now, let me build on this more theoretical introduction and question regarding this tension between the social and the political, and use it as a starting point to address the central point from the book. And this concerns the core argument that we ought to move beyond the distinction between settler and native. And this is the difficult and critical challenge that Mamdani's body of work, not just in his book, but for more than 20 years now, has presented and elucidated for us for many years, and in a way that very few scholars have done. And certainly scholars will be debating this challenge for many years still. And I want to make clear that I do think that this question of settler native is inescapable and must be tackled in Palestine, Israel. Mamdani's case is, I think, groundbreaking and at its strongest in explaining the connections between, and I quote, the violence of post-colonial modernity and the violence of European modernity and colonial direct rule, end quote. His penetrating analysis of post-colonial states like Rwanda and Sudan, I absolutely love the chapter on Sudan, especially in this book, reveals and convincingly shows in detail those connections. But I still have questions about how the challenge itself of destroying the native settler distinction needs to be posed and articulated in settler colonies like Canada, the US, Australia, and Israel. And I separate South Africa here as well, because this challenge, I think, takes a different shape there for many reasons, one of which is that the majority was in fact the colonized. And I think when we're talking about majoritarian and minority identities, I don't want to be crude, but stats matter. So I think the dynamics change where the majority are the settler colonizers, as is the case in Canada, the US, and Australia. And when it's more or less 50-50, if you take historic Palestine as a whole, but with the big caveat that there is an ongoing political project to make it roughly 80-20. Let's be upfront about what Israel means when it says it wants a majority Jewish population. It wants it at around 80-20, if not more. So theoretically speaking, the difference is this: in the colonial setting, indirect rule politicized ethnic and racial identities so as to facilitate rule over the native. In the settler colonial setting, a kind of indirect rule politicized ethnic and racial identities so as to facilitate not the rule over, but the elimination of the native. And sure, elimination appears in the post-colonial setting that comes in the aftermath of colonial indirect rule, which came in the aftermath of colonial direct rule. But in the settler colony, we're not in the aftermath. We're in the thick of the colonial moment. And I think that makes a difference. And this is why. It is doubtful for me, I think, that a strategy to eradicate the indigenous settler distinction will yield an improvement in the lived realities of indigenous peoples in Canada, for example. In fact, it will likely, I think, do the opposite and suffocate decolonial indigenous movements and voices. Certainly, indigenous activists and scholars would agree with Mamdani, and I quote from his book, that self-identification is not the same as self-determination, end quote. That indigenous decolonization is about more than reclaiming cultural identities and cultural autonomy and such things. And I think that nowhere is that critique more penetrating and harsher than in indigenous activism and scholarship. The point that Audra Simpson and many others like Glenn Coulthard and Leanne Simpson have emphasized, though, and in my view rightly so, is that indigenous identity is in itself part of the regeneration of a decolonial alternative. That their identities are not merely national identities that operate within the logic of the nation state, but are rather identities that engender a new kind of social and political community. Their claim to sovereignty, for instance, does not operate in accordance with the logics of the Euro-American nation state or Euro-American sovereignty. In fact, Simpson says in her book that the word sovereignty is probably not the right word to describe the indigenous sovereignty that she's pushing for. This is not to deny that established political organizations and associations have played the settler colonist game and are enabling their rule and even the elimination of indigenous people, but they're critical of that as well, and they're trying to advance notions of identity and sovereignty that are trying to reinvigorate the decolonial effort against settler colonialism. So I think that their claim to sovereignty is more akin to Debashi's notion of sovereignty of the nation as that which evades the totalizing and eliminatory power of the settler colonial nation state. So far from standing in the way of decolonization, this element of indigenous sovereignty is the excess that opposes the completion of an ongoing settler colonial project of elimination. So this excess is decolonization. Let me dig further into Mamdani's solution to this problem of dissolving the native settler distinction in the settler colony.
Ayyash?
Oh, sorry?
Before you dig further, also summarize, please.
Okay, sure.
So
I want to briefly explore how he calls on us to focus on the victims and perpetrators of violence as survivors. So, and this is coming to the end. So this would, of course, be part of a project of decoupling the nation state and decolonizing the political. So this is not a liberal equality kind of approach. And at the core of the shift towards survivors is the effort, and I quote from Mamdani, not to avenge the dead, but to give the living a second chance. And in this quote, we find Mamdani's excellent and timely critique of the criminal violence approach and how it depoliticizes violence. So the critique of neoliberal human rights discourses and the legalistic approach to extreme violence is certainly much needed here. So let's focus on the political approach then. And I won't mention Codessa because he's already discussed that quite well. So, you know, similarly to what Codessa did, basically for Palestine, Israel, in Palestine, you know, the path forward towards survivorhood would happen when the enemy would not be Israeli Jewish settlers, but the Israeli settler state, not Jews or Israelis, but Israeli Jewish supremacy. And this is a promising path, but I have 3 questions. I'll cut one out to shorten up. So I'll ask 2 questions. First, I think many segments of the Palestinian liberation struggle have framed their resistance in precisely those terms for over 100 years. And that the state is and Jewish supremacy is the problem and the enemy, not Jews. And the result has been nobody's listening. Israelis walk past us just the same. Most Israelis don't just lack the knowledge about Palestine and Palestinians, they don't want that knowledge and actively oppose it and or avoid it and its lessons and consequences. So for the problem for Palestinians is not an epistemological one, at least not primarily that. So what to do with the power piece of power knowledge is really critical for me. And this is why I think there are certain elements of BDS that I think are a little bit missed in Mamdani's. We can talk more about those later in the discussion. So I'll skip the second question and just reach to the end here. So the other question that I have about the switch to survivorhood revolves around this notion of the enemy, of transforming enemies into adversaries, which Mamdani says is critical in this shift. But if identities are ensconced in an ongoing political project of displacement and elimination, then can we talk about sovereign enemies who belong to the same order or structure of sovereignty? Are we presented with a situation in which there exists equally sovereign Palestinian and Israeli selves who are, as it were, players in the game of enmity? Or are we presented with a situation where enmity is precisely the outcome of the elimination of indigenous sovereignty and selfhood? Can you turn into an adversary an identity which is predicated on your elimination? I'm not raising this question to dismiss the necessity of reimagining Israeli and Palestinian identities. I'm on board with that project, but rather to point towards how deep that reimagination needs to go, to the uneven nature of that transformation, and establishing the obstacles which stand in the way of that reimagination. Mamdani makes the point that, and I quote, racial political identities of the past were not timeless, but rather created by political processes, end quote. Certainly, but were not these identities, more properly speaking, produced and created by violent political processes? And dare I make this proposition, which I actually do make in my own book, were not these identities produced and created by violence itself, where violence, as it were, creates the casing in which the political then comes to take shape? Because if I'm right about this latter question or slash proposition, then this has serious political consequences for any political process that seeks to take as its starting point a reality that has been constituted as real by violence. Meaning, the very terms of the political process are from the outset determined and guided by violences that have rendered those terms as real. So we must confront and transform that casing of violence, which is the biggest obstacle for me. Because if we don't, we end up with a political process where things like cultural Zionism sees itself as a form of resistance in the political, and I have serious doubts about its ability to do that. Even in non-Zionist and anti-Zionist positions, we often find that they fail to properly transform this casing of violence. The Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism, to me, is a perfect example of that. One more minute, if that's okay. One more minute. Okay. Become different, they said, in order that your fate as colonized peoples can be different, to reiterate from that Said quote that I began with. We can agree with Mamdani, with Said, Césaire, Fanon, and Debashi that the closed, fixed, univocal, and bounded nationalism of Euro-America is the enemy in this decolonial project. But the big question remains, whose path leads us away from settler colonial violence and the violence of the modern nation state? An inclusive and common path, that's needed for sure. But on whose and what terms is this path imagined and written? If we only or primarily focus on the living and give the living a second chance, then what have we done with the memories of the dead, to the voices of the dead? Perhaps far from favoring living over the dead, we need to listen more carefully and closely to the voices of the dead, not necessarily for avenging the dead, but for fulfilling the promise of their struggle for a justice that both precedes and exceeds codification in law and even in the political. For the remnants, for the excess that they both reveal and leave behind, that source of vitality and direction that resists representation, yes, yet it points us towards the new. And what is decolonial struggle, if not the struggle for the new, for that which refuses, opposes, and transforms the terms constituted by and through the violences of the post-colonial and settler colonial nation state. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ayyash. Thank you very much, Professor Mamdani. And probably what is really important to keep in mind while thinking about your book and about your your advice to look at racial political identities as historized and changeable is also how can we add transitional justice into this whole set of solutions. I'll be happy to have questions. You may raise your hand or write your question. And then we'll gather several questions and then get back to Professor Mamdani to summarize and Dr. Ayyash to comment on. So I had Osama and I had one question from Ashraf. Osama, no, Irene first. Yeah. Irene needs to leave, so for a different.
Thank you. I hope I will still have time to hear the answer. I have just one question. You talked about epistemological awareness among the Blacks and the white in South Africa, and this awareness made them see or view identity as Black and white as a historical process. And then I heard Mark talked about how he views Palestine or how you presented Palestine and this awareness, but I didn't read the book. So I would like to hear from you, how would you see this awareness reflected among Palestinians and Israel and Jews in Israel and among Mizrahi Jews in Israel? I have another very quick question. You talked about to differentiate between, or to distinguish actually between boycotting Israel and boycotting Israeli society. How would you see boycotting a lecturer or any sports person who represent Israel or represent Israel University? Is this when the BDS calls for boycotting lecturer from Israel University? Is this boycotting for this person even if he's anti-Zionist academic, or this is boycotting the person himself? Thank you very much. Thank you, and for Mark, it was very interesting night. Shukran.
Yes, thank you, Professor Mamdani, for a fascinating talk. I come from the field of medicine and public health, and what a lot of a lot of people in public health start to argue with the critical race theories, where we can see that the identities you've mentioned were not only portrayed as ethnic or national, but also as biological. And we saw that people that were seen, whether it's German, Greek, British, who were seen distinctively different in the continent, when they go to settle in the Americas or in Australia, they are seen as white as a biological identity even versus the indigenous. And we saw that process happen in Israel, where people speak of Jewish as a biological identity even. And if we open the statistics that Israel produces about the life expectancy, the prevalence of diabetes or other kinds of diseases, they become to be explored and solidified as distinctive biological identities, which of course are very fluid, because if an Israeli migrates to the US to relocate, if he's Ashkenazi white, he would be considered white, and if he's Ethiopian, he would probably be considered black, to another biological identities. So throughout your research, how did the biological argument portray itself in the different settings that you've explored? Thank you.
Maybe I'll have mine. Professor Mamdani, when you talk about citizenship as granted on the basis of residence and looking at the survivors of a political entity, do you look at survivors in the Israel-Palestine as only those who live now on the territory from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River? And if so, how do you think, or should be also a solution that includes those who were removed and exiled and eliminated from their homeland? There were two more questions, I think. I'll just read them. Ashraf Badr asked, is the Palestinian Authority considered as a form of indirect rule in comparison to India in the era of colonialism, or there is a fundamental difference between the two cases? I assume it's not India, but rather Indian reservations, but I'm not sure. And the second was probably more of a comment than a question. Is I don't see who voiced it, but it says Hannah Arendt in the 7th chapter of her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, entitled Race and Bureaucracy, argues that colonial settlements provided fertile grounds for genocide in Europe, while Professor Mamdani argues that it was the nation state in the era of European modernity that provides the ground for the idea of genocide and ethnic cleansing. If you can also comment on that. Professor Mamdani, the floor is yours. You have 5 to 7 minutes.
I'm sorry, the last question, I'm not sure I got.
It's not a question, it's more of a comment, I think.
But the first part, you said there are 2 issues here. I couldn't get which were the 2 issues in the first part.
Yeah, the person who wrote it compares between your argument and Hannah Arendt's argument. He says that, or she, I'm not sure, that in her race and bureaucracy chapter, she argues that colonial settlements provided fertile grounds for genocide in Europe, while he thinks that you argue that it was the nation state in the era of European modernity that provided the ground for the idea of genocide and ethnic cleansing. What do you think? I'll try to just send it to you also by chat, by personal chat, so that you can see.
So how many hours are you going to give me to answer this question?
I think you have 10 minutes at least.
Look, first of all,
so you should decide how to divide your time.
Let me say, this is a feast, first of all. I'm hugely grateful to my discussant, Mark Muhammad Ayyash, for a very thought through, considered, even sympathetic reading of the book, but at the same time, a critical reading of the book. And the juxtaposition of Hamid Dabashi's reflections on nation state and mine. Hamid's claim. I haven't read Hamid Dabashi's book. I'm ashamed to say that, but I will read it now after hearing this comment. So as Professor Ayyash says, Hamid's claim that the nation needs to be rescued from the state, and his summation of my claim that the state needs to be rescued from the nation. And the common ground being that there needs to be a decoupling of nation and state. Now, I'm saying something more than just decoupling of the nation and the state. I'm also asking us to rethink the whole notion of nation. I'm saying that nation is necessarily a political category, and we need to rethink that rethink the politicization of the notion of nation. If you look at liberal understanding of nation, liberalism sort of dismisses any notion of a collective identity, except one. The only collective identity liberalism embraces as natural is the nation. None other, to my knowledge. And not only liberalism, but I think Marxism too. Because if you read Marx and Engels, Marx distinguishes between what he calls historical nations and non-historical nations. And historical nations are nations who are destined to create their own state, and thus a nation state. And non-historical nations are destined to live as minorities in a nation state, which is not theirs. So I think we need to come up with another form of the state, and with also another imagination of society itself. Not simply nation and state and just disjoin them. I think the work that is needed is a little more complex. I'm just trying to go through these. So I started taking notes, and then at some point, I fell way behind Professor Ayyash, and I just put ... and I started taking the next set of comments. So that's how I will go. The question on the social and the political, I think it's a great question, and I entirely agree that the task, Professor Ayyash says the social task, and I really argue that this is a primary political task, which is that of undoing the fragmentation. Undoing the fragmentation that the colonial political project has imposed on the colonized. And this is not specific to settler colonialism. This is specific to all forms of indirect rule colonialism, starting, I would say, from late 19th century. And I argue that without this task, the task of social justice will more than likely end up in a civil war because it will divide. It will not just pit settler against native, but it will divide natives into different groups. One of the biggest sort of learning experiences for me was the Rwanda genocide. I belong to the first generation of post-colonial African intellectuals. And we believed that violence after independence was either going to be revolutionary violence or counter-revolutionary violence. We were Marxists. And lo and behold came the Rwandan genocide. And we now witnessed a violence which was neither revolutionary nor counter-revolutionary. This was a violence in which the rich were divided, the poor were divided, and the dividing lines were not market-based identities. The dividing lines were identities produced and made durable by the state through a complex project of history writing, lawmaking, at least those, and census taking, and this made me realize that the political question, which had been understood by nationalists, is really more or less an external question, and the social question is an internal question. The division did not make sense because the political question had to be understood as both external, which is, in other words, independence from an external power, but also internal, which is the understanding that the colonial power had remade the political community by kind of taking the differences and creatively deciding which differences to politicize and which ones not to. And this, I think, is the contribution of Henry Maine after the 1857 uprising in India. Maine basically said that 1857, the great crisis of British colonialism, was not a military crisis, it was an epistemic crisis. It was an epistemic crisis because of this hubris of hubris called the civilizing mission, this top-down project of changing society, the state changing society from above. And Maine argued this will never be sustainable until the British understood the agency of the colonized, and not only of the colonized as a collective, but an agency which rested on internal differences also, and based on that epistemological project, it would go on to decipher which differences would help build it a coalition, and divide the colonized. Anyway, I argue that this is a big political challenge, not really a social challenge, a political challenge. It's a challenge that has to be taken on board first and foremost. Survivors. Well, I don't know. Well, I'm not particularly fond of notions of sovereignty. I do not think that it's a question of who is sovereign and who is not. I don't think that there is any part of the world where you don't have minorities alongside majorities, and I don't think the sovereignty of the majority and non-sovereign minorities, or if you make both of them sovereign, and if you understand by sovereign political self-determination, then unless we come up with reformed federal structures, this will just give us an endless splitting politically. I also think that see, if you take the examples of Australia, of the US, of Canada, I agree that these examples are different from South Africa or of Israel now, where Israel is wanting to go, because the South African example is one where the two-state solution failed. Apartheid was not able to impose a two-state solution, and therefore the oppressed remained the majority. In the American case, the oppressed were expelled, either killed off or expelled into reservations outside the polity of the US, Australia, etc. And Israel, that is the process that began with the Nakba, and that is the process they hope to continue. I mean, for me, the interesting comparison is between the American Indians and the African slaves. African Americans are, well, what, 15% of the population? If you take the history of their population, there has been throughout a contest on the way forward. One group has insisted on self-determination, with the self being defined as the African American self. The other group has insisted on a common citizenship. The self-determination group began with the Liberian question of returning to Africa, and ended up establishing a colony. Then the next phase was the demand to create a Negro nation in certain sections of the South where Negroes or blacks were the majority. And the counter position was W.B. Du Bois and the struggle for citizenship. I believe that Du Bois's position has been vindicated. So has Martin Luther King's position been vindicated. And the strength of the African American struggle has not flowed from its numbers. It has flowed from its capacity to build alliances and to articulate a general grievance inside its own very specific grievance. So I think and I think the failure of the reservation Indians to charter this kind of a course is because they were isolated in reservations. Their possibility of building alliances was undercut. So I really do not think that self-determination is the way to go forward. And I realize that this is not a sufficient answer. We'll have to discuss this in some length, but the 10 minutes I'm sure are over, but I'm going to stretch them into a little more to say.
That's fine. We started 7 minutes later, so it's fine.
Okay. So where am I? I'm trying to go through my notes. Look, when I'm talking of the Palestinian people, I'm not just talking of those inside fixed boundaries. I'm also talking very much of those who were expelled from within these boundaries, precisely in an attempt to disenfranchise them, and an attempt to delink their past from their present. So the notion that I'm sorry, that was a mosquito, so I had to get it away from me. But in terms of biological as opposed to ethnic or national identities, and of course the prime biological identity is race. And it is as historical as any ethnic identity, any national identity. The attempt to, of course, define Judaism as a biological identity, I think, is a see-through attempt, more or less. Hannah Arendt, well, bureaucracy is about really the capacity of the state to implement a genocide from above. But genocide, I think, wherever it happens, is not just a state project. It is a coming together. It's both a state project and a social project. And the social project is encoded in that second word in Arendt's formulation, which is race. And race is just one expression of the nation. So I'll stop there. I do want to request that Professor Ayyash, I would like to get access to your remarks. They're very rich, and they will help me think through a lot of aspects of this.
Thank you very much. It was much more than interesting, and I'm really thankful on behalf of al-Carmel for you, Professor Mamdani, for you, Dr. Ayyash. I would
thank you, Banna.
I would also like to say happy Passover to our Jewish audiences, Pesach Sameach v'Kasher, وشعنين مبارك للطوائف المسيحية اللي معيدة اليوم حسب التوقيت الغربي.
كل عام وانتم بخير.
كل عام وانتم بخير جميعا. Thank you very much.
May I also request that
thank you.
What is on the chat can be sent to me?
Yes, I did actually. I'll send it to you by email.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. I really appreciate this.
Thank you, Professor Mahmoud, and thank you, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, Dr., Mr. I don't know what, but Muhammad Mustafa.
Thank you. Thank you.
So do I leave? I think so. Thank you.
If you'd like to. Are you now in Kampala?
Yes, I'm in Kampala. I'm in Kampala, and you know, it goes with the terrain that this is the rainy season, and often there is lightning and thunder, and the internet goes away, and the electricity goes away, and but today I prayed that it would, and it didn't. And you know, as a kid, I learned to recite Arabic without understanding a word, so I can still pray in Arabic.